right. We want to thank you all for attending the first webinar in the Black Friday series. Without further ado, we are going to move forward and begin our student interview with our guest, Gideon Epstein. So without further ado, Toni, please take it away.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Oluwatoni Elewa-Gidado, and I'm a third-year public policy major here at the University of Maryland. And I'm here for the first ever Black Friday webinar. So first, hello, Mr. Epstein. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Toni. Really looking forward to the conversation today, and I'm glad that I'm the first webinar. That's very exciting.
Likewise. So can you please give a quick introduction of yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Gideon Epstein. I'm a fairly recent graduate from the University of Maryland. I was a government and politics student. I graduated in 2019. And now I work as an organizer with the election protection team doing voting rights work with the Voting Rights Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, which is a national racial justice nonprofit based in DC. We're a nonpartisan organization, and the team that I work with helps to safeguard voting rights for all Americans, but especially young voters and traditionally disenfranchised voters.
Awesome. So how did you first gain interest in voting rights?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was definitely while I was a student at the University of Maryland. I think it was during my freshman or sophomore year. There were some local College Park council elections going on, I believe in 2017. And in that election, I was getting involved with the Student Government Association, and some students came to us and shared that they were having trouble getting absentee ballots to vote in these local municipal elections, which have some really direct results on students' lives and the broader College Park community, of course. And the reason that these students were having trouble getting absentee ballots is because at the time, College Park had what's known as an excuse-only absentee ballot request system, which means that as a voter, you have to have a specific reason outlined in the law as to why you need an absentee ballot. And this is actually an issue that's come to the forefront of the 2020 election as many states, some of the states that I work with, for example, require a specific excuse, like you're an elderly voter or like you're going to suffer a result of voting in person, such as having your health and safety put at risk. But going back to 2017, like I said, College Park had a rule that you needed an excuse to get an absentee ballot. So some friends and I went to Annapolis to advocate for a bill in the state legislature and the Maryland General Assembly that would actually make it so that all municipalities across Maryland have to have what's called no excuse absentee voting, which means that anyone who wants an absentee ballot can get one. And that bill was passed. So now every single municipal election, as well as statewide and federal elections and the presidential election, they all have no excuse absentee voting in the state of Maryland. So that sort of was my first foray into what voting rights means and how it can affect students and so many people in our community.
Great. Actually, speaking of which, I know while you attended the University of Maryland, you were a devoted member of Turf Vote. Most notably in 2014, you raised voting rates here on campus from 19 to 46%. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually in 2018, since I was not quite a student at Maryland in 2014, but that figure you shared is definitely accurate. In 2014, the campus had a 19% voting rate, which means that just under 1 in 5 students who was eligible to vote actually casted a ballot in those midterm elections. And in 2018, we were able to raise that student voting rate to almost 50% at 46%, which was a big improvement. So during those 2018 midterms, I was the student co-chair of our campus's Terps Vote coalition. For those of you who don't know, Terps Vote is our campus civic engagement coalition. It brings together students from a variety of student groups and faculty from various departments and also student life organizations that are led by UMD staff together. And we have a steering committee that tries to put together a program that will encourage voting on our campus. So that certainly involves doing more voter registration work with students. So we worked most notably with Mary Perg, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, to do tabling across campus to register students to vote ahead of the 2018 midterm. So I believe we tabled at over 50 events that year, and we registered thousands of students. We encouraged students in Greek life and in the STEM fields areas of campus where we see low voter registration rates to really do so and make sure that they're engaged in our elections. And on top of registration, we really focused on turnout, because we found that after the 2016 election, when there were a ton of students getting active in our political process and getting registered to vote, we really needed to focus on turnout. So the way we did that was providing free shuttle buses to the polls during early voting for residents in the state of Maryland. We sent shuttle buses to Montgomery County, Prince George's County, Baltimore City and County. And in addition to providing early voting resources, like I spoke about before in terms of how important mail-in and absentee voting is, we actually provided free stamps and envelopes for students who were voting by mail. There are a ton of students at Maryland who are out of state and are voting in New Jersey or Texas or wherever they might be from. And we found that Gen Z students are not that accustomed to using snail mail, traditional USPS mail systems. So providing them with a free stamp and envelope for their absentee ballot really, really made it easier. And we saw thousands of students, come into the student government office and pick up those resources to help them cast a ballot on election day.
Oh. So I guess my next question is, what steps did you take after graduating from Maryland that helped you be where you are now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the best thing I did to put myself in the position I'm in right now, working in an area that I'm passionate about in the voting rights space, in this racial justice space more particularly, is being active on campus when I was a student. I think there are definitely a lot of opportunities that, like the School of Public Policy and the Government and Politics Department cater directly for students, like the Federal Fellows Program, which I was personally not part of, but I've heard that's an amazing program for getting, real world experience. We are just a metro stop away from DC, as everyone knows. But I think what I tried to do is not just get off-campus experiences, which I definitely did. I interned in the General Assembly in Annapolis, getting experience with state policymaking. I also interned for a federal agency, or technically not a federal agency, at the Federal Reserve Board. I also, did an internship on Capitol Hill, learning about federal policymaking. And lastly, I worked with a civil rights advocacy organization, the Leadership Conference, just before graduating. But apart from those off-campus experiences, I think what allowed me to get those experiences was actually getting involved on campus. So in addition to my work with Terps Vote, I was pretty active in the student government. Like I spoke about before, I became the government affairs director, working on all our state and federal advocacy goals, mostly centered around college affordability and higher education reform, since those are the issues that are most affecting of students. So that was definitely, a big way that I put myself in a good position to succeed. After I graduated, I was able to, tell folks in interviews for internships that I got, that I had this state and federal advocacy experience just from, doing unpaid volunteer work with the student government. I was also active with another student organization called Maryland Discourse. And we, did and still do hold conversations on campus on a variety of difficult socio-political issues, like gun violence prevention, feminism, environmentalism, race relations, racial justice, to talk with people on sort of both sides of the issue, about how we can come together and find some common ground. So I think really, those three experiences, working with Terps Vote, the student government, and Maryland Discourse, put me in a good position to, get a job in a field that I was really interested in after graduating.
Wow. So after spending some time on Capitol Hill, did any of your experiences affect your point of view from the time you worked with Terps Vote to where you work for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law?
That's an interesting question. I definitely think, working on Capitol Hill and also doing federal advocacy at the Leadership Conference, which is sort of a convener of a bunch of different civil rights organizations, that definitely brought a new perspective to me. I started to understand, I think, a lot more civil rights issues that just go deeper beneath the surface that, some of us are not aware of. So one issue that I got to work on Capitol Hill was getting post-secondary education opportunities for incarcerated individuals. That's an issue where we need to allow people who are justice impacted or previously or currently incarcerated the right to get a college education or finish their GED if that's the case. So that's just an example of one issue that I feel very strongly about. I think we need a more restorative and rehabilitative justice system, not one that just penalizes people for committing crimes, but it tries to get them back into our society. So that was one kind of racial justice issue that made me interested in working for a civil rights organization. The Leadership Conference, which I spoke about before, they're more of a federal advocacy organization that's lobbying on bills that have a civil rights lens. And now at the Lawyers Committee, the work that I do helps support a team of litigators who are filing lawsuits to protect voting rights, safeguard people from hate crimes, doing education equity work, and so much more.
And can you describe to me the importance of voting?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's something that I grappled with a lot working with Terps Vote, because we were trying to reach out to students in these STEM fields in the Smith School of Business, in Greek life, communities on campus that are not always as politically active as students in the public policy school and in government and politics. What I found, just in thinking about that, is that we've got to connect to the issues in elections to students and, voters more generally. So talking about how research funding is connected to elections, that's, can become an important issue for STEM majors in particular. Talking about how local city ordinances can affect students in Greek life and really all students across our campus. So connecting local and state issues in particular to students is important, but I think that there are also federal issues that we can connect to students. I know one for me is securing mental health funding for higher education institutions. I definitely think that we don't have enough resources on campus, at no fault of the counseling center at all, but just because there aren't enough resources there, there end up being students in need who don't get the help that they need. And when we can talk about those issues with students across campus, it really encourages them to think about, how their vote makes a difference, and why they should turn out, and that ultimately their one vote literally can change the outcome of an election and change the way of life for people in their community.
So now, can you describe 866 Our Vote in more detail?
Absolutely. So 866 Our Vote is the National Election Protection Hotline. It's a nonpartisan hotline that the Lawyers Committee runs. So this past election cycle in 2020, since January, we've gotten over 240,000 calls from voters across the country. And, these voters are calling in with questions about, just where is my polling place? They're asking what kind of voter ID do I need to bring to the polling place? They're calling and saying, my absentee ballot hasn't arrived. What can I do to make sure that I can cast a ballot this fall? They were definitely talking about some voter intimidation issues that really came to the forefront this past election. So a variety of different issues. I would say that some of them turn out to be, more administrative failure. Like if a voter, many of whom were in Maryland, didn't receive their mail-in ballot by election day, or actually a week before election day, which is really when you need it by, we would do the follow-up with our state partners on the ground, working with state-based organizations like Common Cause and the ACLU. And with these groups, we'd reach out to the elections board, whether it be the state board of elections or a local board of elections in each county, and try to ensure that we can get a ballot to the voter who's in need, or try to make sure that an election official or a poll worker can intervene when there's voter intimidation going on at a polling place. And the other aspects of the election protection program more broadly are nonpartisan poll monitoring and our litigation team, which I briefly spoke about earlier. So we have literally thousands of poll monitors. I believe we recruited in the ballpark of 40,000 nonpartisan poll monitors, along with our partners at the National Common Cause, to survey polling places in their communities, in their state, and then call into the 866 Our Vote hotline when there's an issue at their polling place, or just be in touch with our state team to make sure that we can intervene if there's an issue going on. And really, with all this information gathered through the election protection hotline and gathered by our poll monitors, our litigators are able to do their work so effectively. They've got a lot of information. And I was just talking with our litigation team this past week. And I'm not an attorney, but our attorneys filed over 50 lawsuits in 2020 to safeguard voting rights. A lot of cases around vote by mail, some additional cases after the election to make sure that every vote that was casted legally was counted properly. I just heard, in past years, some years we just filed 2 lawsuits, but this year with the gravity of the situation, there was a lot more litigation needed. And it's amazing to be part of that effort.
Wow. So in terms of voting, what are some of the biggest issues you've seen here in the state of Maryland?
Yeah, I think around voting rights, we've come a long way in the last few years. So just to speak about some reforms made in the last 10 years, we've allowed formerly incarcerated individuals the right to vote. And I think we're still working on getting them that right procedurally, which I'll talk about in a minute. And also in the past 10 years, we've passed same-day registration, which allows voters to register to vote on election day. I would say one of the biggest issues that we hear about into the election protection hotline is voters who want to vote on election day, and maybe they didn't think about the need to register to vote ahead of election day. And most states, have voter registration deadline in mid-October or so. But luckily here in Maryland, if you're a voter who didn't register by that deadline, you can go to your polling place on election day and register on the spot right there and cast your ballot right after. So that's a very important reform that I think a lot of other states are still working on, and our federal government's going to start working on as well in this new Congress. We've also implemented automatic voter registration, which means that if you go to get your driver's license when you turn 16 or 17 or whatever age you go to get your license, it'll be an opt-out system rather than an opt-in system. So this means that the norm will be that you'll get registered to vote and you'll have to choose not to, rather than having to opt in and say, affirmatively, I do want to get registered. So that's resulted in, I think, fewer of these issues where people are not registered to vote when they should be. And to speak about, the current legislative session in Annapolis and some of the policies that lawmakers are pushing this session. One important bill that I've been following is a bill from Delegate Ludke and Senator Elfrith around student voting to make sure that every campus, like UMD, has a professional staff member dedicated to supporting student voting on campus. That legislation is called the Student and Military Voter Empowerment Act. If any of you want to look it up and advocate for it. And the other piece of legislation that I've been following and I've actually actively been involved in advocacy with is called the Value My Vote Act. It goes back to the idea that we should let justice-impacted individuals vote. There's a whole group of individuals who have been arrested and are now sitting in state jails across the state. And retain their right to vote because they have not been convicted of any crime. They're what's called pre-trial. So they haven't had their trial yet, and no determination has been made about their guilt, whether it be a misdemeanor or a felony. And they legally retain the right to vote. But unfortunately, if you're sitting in jail, there's no way that you can register to vote right now. There's no way you can find out about when you need to request your absentee ballot by. So this bill, the Value My Vote Act, which is sponsored by Delegate Wilkins, it would ensure that jails are providing those pieces of information about when you need to request your absentee ballot, when you need to get registered to vote by, to justice impacted individuals ahead of each election. So those are a few big issues around voting rights in Maryland that I've been following for the last few years.
All right, and we're running low on time, so I'm going to ask you 2 more questions before I give it back to Aisha, and she opens it up to our community here, our audience. So one of my last 2 questions is, for students who are considered out of state, how would they vote, and would they be able to vote on campus, or would they have to go home to their hometown in order to vote?
Yeah, good question. So this was definitely an issue that I thought about a lot working with Turks Vote back in 2018. Students who are out of state can register on campus at the University of Maryland using their dorm or off-campus housing address, or they can register back home at their home address. That's just a general rule of thumb for any college student across the country. Luckily, Maryland doesn't have any kind of voter ID needed to cast a ballot. You just need to prove residency with like a utility bill or with some other proof of residency showing that you live in the state of Maryland 9-10 months out of the year. And that would be plenty sufficient to register to vote. I would say for some students that are in-state, maybe they live on the Eastern Shore or they live in Baltimore, so it would be a long drive to get back home to vote. They want to decide whether they want to register to vote on campus or using their home address. And I would just note that some students are benefiting from scholarships based on their residency back at home, and that is only secured with voter registration. So that's just something we pointed out to students every time. We say, yes, you can register to vote here on campus or back at home. It's totally up to you, but everyone should consider the consequences like their scholarship opportunities when doing so.
All right. My last question is, what legacy would you want to leave after you finish your career?
It's a good question. I'll probably have to think about it some more. But I think something that I found to be important, rewarding, and cathartic in my very short career so far is just working with voters directly and working with disenfranchised populations. I'm definitely a people's person. And like I said, I find a lot of catharsis in talking with people who are in need and trying to help them out. That's one of the reasons that I've really enjoyed supporting our election protection hotline, because we're hearing from voters who clearly want help and they need help from a legal expert, which is what we're able to supply. And in some cases, I get to call back these voters and, get someone in their community to maybe deliver a ballot to them if that's legal within the state rules, or help them otherwise to secure a ballot and secure their right to vote.
Great. And are there any final words you would like to say?
I don't think so. I'm happy to take any questions from the folks on this call.
All right, Elisa.
Yes, Gideon, thank you so much. One of the first questions we have is how is public policy impacted by voting?
Yeah, good question. I think I would just go back to what I spoke about earlier in terms of connecting specific policy issues to voting, especially for students and voters more broadly who are not always as politically engaged. I really believe that there is, even if not a hotly discussed political issue, there is a more niche policy issue that affects every single voter in our democracy. I just saw in the new stimulus package that the administration is trying to raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. Folks can certainly agree or disagree with that policy, but I think it's inarguable that it would affect students on campus in a variety of ways, by raising their wages. And I think some folks would argue that it may reduce the number of jobs available to students if employers are forced to make cutbacks. So there are just a variety of policy issues that we can connect. Another one that I spoke about earlier briefly was research funding. One issue that I feel strongly about is gun violence prevention. I think we need more federal funding around gun violence prevention. If we can't study something, we can't find a way to fix the problem, fix the epidemic. So that's one issue that I certainly spoke to a lot of students about, in addition to mental health funding.
Have you found any challenges in partnering with similar organizations that serve similar missions? If so, what are the top 3?
That's a great question. So I would definitely say, in addition to our nonpartisan election protection hotline, the Democratic Party runs their own voter protection hotline. So that's an example of an organization that does similar work. I would say that, our nonpartisan hotline offers some benefits just in terms of credibility, that it's hard for, the Democratic Party's voter protection hotline to take. We definitely don't coordinate at all, as that would, put our nonpartisan status in jeopardy. There are also some state-based organizations that do similar work. But I would really say that it's more of a partnership between our national organization doing voter protection in over 30 states, including Maryland, And these state-based organizations, Common Cause, the League of Women Voters, the ACLUs, NAACP chapters, all of those organizations are focused on stopping voter suppression and helping every eligible voter cast their ballot and have that ballot count. But it is much more of a partnership than any kind of competing effort, I would say.
Please mention again the legislation you worked on in Congress to help incarcerated people vote.
Okay. So the legislation I was talking about to help incarcerated people vote was in the General Assembly this session in the state of Maryland only. So that legislation is called the Value My Vote Act. It's sponsored by Delegate Wilkins. I don't have the bill number off the top of my head, but I think if you search for Value My Vote Act, you will find it. And like I said before, it would get folks who are not determined guilty of any crime, but just sitting in jail pre-trial, the right to vote procedurally. Right now, they retain the right to vote legally, but there's no actual way that they can get an absentee ballot, get their voter registration done in time before Election Day. So that's definitely a big priority for the Lawyers Committee and something that I feel strongly about right now.
I believe that's all the questions. Do we have any other questions from our audience members? One more. How have you worked with others that have different opinions?
I like that question. Well, there's people who have different opinions about policy issues, so that's always interesting. And to me, it's just important to respect everyone's view on a particular issue. We all come from different backgrounds. And I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing. That's what makes our country and our community at UMD and really all over the state of Maryland so special. I really enjoy talking with people who have different views about policy issues. I try to be a listener first and foremost. It's not always about listening so that you can respond. It's about listening so that you can understand someone else's perspective. And then in addition to disagreements over policy matters, I actually had a conversation with someone who was part of the Communist Party of DC during the 2018 election, who actually said that they discouraged voting, that they think that that doing more traditional organizing around protests is how we ought to go about change in this country. So I hear that perspective, I would say more rarely, but what I would say to that is protesting is great. It's amazing that it's secured in our First Amendment, the right to protest, the right to assemble, but it's not an either or. It's not vote or protest. It's an and. We can vote and protest at the same time. And that's what I'd encourage folks to do if they feel strongly about a particular issue or a candidate who's in office who shouldn't be, who shouldn't have that power.
And we have one last question. And that question reads, should Election Day be on the weekend like many other countries?
That's an interesting question. I would say I more regularly hear people talk about should Election Day just be a holiday? Should we make it a federal holiday? And my personal opinion is absolutely. I think we have federal holidays for all kinds of relatively, non-substantive activities. While they're certainly important, we have Indigenous Peoples Day or Columbus Day, depending on who you ask. And that's an example of a holiday where we honor, communities and people who have brought this country to where it is today. But I would like to see more federal holidays with like an actionable item that Americans can take, like voting. So I think we should make, the presidential election a federal holiday every 4 years and make sure that everyone has equal access to the ballot. Because the bottom line is it's much easier for a well-off individual to take off a few hours from their workday than someone who is literally, working paycheck to paycheck, who can't take off those few hours to cast a ballot. So that would definitely be a big step in the right direction to ensure that everyone has the same access to the ballot.
All right, Gideon, we want to thank you for being the first speaker in our Black Friday series. We've learned a lot. We're definitely going to send information to the participants about 866 Our Vote and how they can get involved. And that is one last question also. what are your parting words for students, faculty, and staff who want to get engaged right now and get prepared? And although we don't have a major presidential election going on right now, but how can they get involved like right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, a lot of the work in the voting rights world is focused on state level advocacy. I would really encourage folks to look up the two bills in the General Assembly that I mentioned before, the Value My Vote Act and the Student and Military Voter Empowerment Act. Those are bills that anyone can testify on if you're a resident of the state of Maryland. You don't need to be a registered lobbyist to testify on a bill in our state, which is, in my opinion, a good thing. And then I would say in future elections, when we get to 2021 and 2022, there are a lot of municipal elections going on this year, and more statewide elections going on next year. It'll be another great opportunity to get involved with Terps Vote if you're a student. I'd really encourage folks to get involved with Terps Vote. It's an amazing organization, and it still has a strong presence on campus. And if you want to get involved with the voter protection work that the Election Protection Coalition is doing, you can go to protectthevote.net, and you'll be registered to volunteer with our team in Maryland whenever the next election that we're running election protection is. But I just want to say thank you to Aisha and Toni for organizing this conversation. It's been really, really fun, and always great to be back with the UMD community. So thank you all so much.
Let's Gideon, we want to thank you again. We also want to remind our audience that our next webinar is coming up on next Friday, and we are going to have our guest speaker will be Donna Brazil, and she is going to speak about how public policy intersects with voting behavior and the impact it's had on Black America. We also want to let our audience know that on February 3rd, we're actually going to have Maryland Delegate Lukey come and speak about House Bill 156 and how our students can get involved and have some advocacy. And that should be our next webinar on February 3rd within a series. So we want to thank you for the information, and hopefully we can have you on speaking about some other things.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, everybody.